thank you all for coming today. It's so nice to see everybody in the audience sporting the End Jew Hatred t-shirt. It looks fabulous. I love it. I want to thank specifically you, Rabbi Corey and Anita and Andrea, and of course, Alexandra and Adar, and everybody who's speaking today. And I heard the message from Counselor Pasternak, and I'm so grateful for his support of the movement. I'm very, very pleased to be here today, although I can't be with you in person, and I apologize in advance. I'm a little bit under the weather, so my throat is a bit scratchy. But, you know, we're all here for the same reason. And the reason why we're here today is not just to talk about anti-Semitism. Our community has a habit of having conferences and events and sending out newsletters, complaining and talking about what's happening. But we're here because we all want to do something about it. And up until now, basically what's been the standard is that we're told if you want to do something to fight anti-Semitism, write a check to one of our major organizations and they will take care of it for us. But we can see that that is not working. And everyone here, I hope, feels the way that I do, which is that the time for personal responsibility is now. So we wanted to have this gathering because we wanted to provide members of the community with strategies and tactics and messaging of what they can do to stand up and make a real difference and achieve real change with and together with the End Jew Hatred movement, being a part of the movement and together with all the chapters of the movement around the world. And we launched End Jew Hatred because we realized, and this was incredible to me, is that there has never been a Jewish civil rights movement in modern history. We are in the age of minority rights movements. It's completely different to be Black now than it was 5 years ago. It's very different to be gay now than it was 2 years ago. It's very different to be a woman than it was 10 years ago. And yet, why is it in the age of minority rights movements where we're seeing all these seismic changes and shifts for other minorities that the Jewish community still has not achieved parity, that it's still socially acceptable to engage in Jew hatred? And why is it that we're seeing a rise of anti-Semitism? And when I was studying this question about 3 years ago, it occurred to me what I said earlier: there has never been a Jewish civil rights movement in modern history. There's been Jews for other minority rights, Jews marching for Black Lives Matter, Jews marching for women's rights, Jews marching for gays' rights. But there's never been a Jews for Jews civil rights movement. Let that sink in, because that is an incredible fact to digest, especially when we look around and we see the anti-Semitism rising and we're asking ourselves, why aren't our civil rights being protected? So the time is now to launch a civil rights movement on behalf of the Jewish people. What does that mean? We've had movements, right? We had, for example, the Soviet Jewry movement, which was very successful, which got hundreds of thousands of members of the Jewish community and our allies on the street protesting for the Jews elsewhere, for the Jews in the Soviet Union to escape and come to Israel or come to Canada or come to the United States where they could exercise those civil rights and get equal protection. We had also the Zionist movement, which was started over 125 years ago by Theodor Herzl. But again, it was a movement to get Jews out of where they were and achieve sovereignty in our ancient homeland in the state of Israel. But what a civil rights movement does is it argues that we as a minority community, in fact, is the oldest, most persecuted minority community in recorded human history, deserve our civil rights to be protected here and now. We don't have to move to Israel. We don't have to flee. We demand equal protection here and now. And our rights to equal protection have nothing to do with what's happening thousands of miles away in the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the more that we respond to anti-Jewish discrimination with pro-Israel advocacy, the more we give that whole notion that you can hate a foreign country and project your hatred of Israel on someone here in Canada because they're Jewish, the more we give that credence. So when we launched the End Jew Hatred movement about 2.5 years ago, it followed a study. Now, I was 8 months pregnant with my third child when COVID hit. And at that time, I was living in Brooklyn, and Black Lives Matter was rioting and looting in my neighborhood and up and down Madison Avenue. And yet everybody, including my friends, was hashtagging Black Lives Matter. You know, the same group of people who were pro-Israel, who were Zionists, were marching in the Me Too movement behind Linda Sarsour. But when Israel was under attack, and I asked these same people to post something on social media to support Israel, all of them declined to do so. They were happy to engage in virtue signaling and posting for other minority rights movements, but they were too afraid to do it for themselves. So at that time, again, I was just about to go on my maternity leave, and everything with all these minority rights movements were happening. And so I commissioned a study, and we spent 1.5 months doing a deep dive into the Black Lives Matter movement, the New Women's Movement, the Black Civil Rights Movement of the 50s and 60s, the End Asian Hate Movement, the LGBTQIA+ movement, and other movements. And what we wanted to understand was, what were the messaging, the strategies, the tactics, how were they organized, how were they funded? What were they doing that we were not doing? Why were they achieving success, and yet the Jewish community was unable to achieve the same success? And from that study, we learned 5 very important things that I talk about in my book, End Jew Hatred, A Manual for Mobilization, but which I'm going to do is summarize for you all today. Because what I'd like you to do is leave this meeting, leave this conference with these 5 ideas in your head to inform your advocacy, so that you can also engage in strategies that actually work, not letter writing campaigns, not email lists, not even conferences about anti-Semitism. What are the strategies and tactics that we have to adopt as a Jewish civil rights movement to finally affect the change that we need to see to stop the ebbs and flows of anti-Semitism coming and going? So the first thing we learned, and I alluded to it earlier, was that a successful civil rights movement has to talk about civil rights. When Jewish students come to us and they say, we want to be advocates, we say, well, you have to be pro-Israel. You have to memorize a 15-page pamphlet on why Israel isn't an apartheid state. You basically have to get a law degree to learn about UN resolutions and, armistice lines and so on, and treaties and the Oslo Accord. You have to go into the arena with a shield, not a sword. You have to be on the defense, and you have to defend a country. Sometimes it's a country you've never been to. Certainly it's a country you have no control of. You never served in the IDF. And that's what we're told is what it means to be a Jewish advocate. Well, the study showed the opposite. In order to have a successful civil rights movement, you don't set up a binary. The message has to be in the name, right? Black Lives Matter. If you are against Black Lives Mattering, you are a racist. No matter what's happening with the looting and the fraud, you cannot disagree with the premise. When we describe ourselves as pro-Israel, immediately we're setting up a binary. If I'm pro-Israel, then I recognize there's another side. There's anti-Israel, there's pro-Palestinian. And if I'm an objective person, I need to come in, I need to hear both sides, I need to understand both of your truths, and then I'm going to come, somewhere in the middle. That is why we call ourselves the End Jew Hatred Movement, because we're not mincing words. We're against Jew hatred. And if you are against ending hatred against Blacks, ending hatred against gays, ending hatred against Muslims, then so too must you be against ending hatred against Jews, or you are the bigot. And there's no excuses. You cannot project your hatred of a foreign country on someone because of their race, ethnicity, or how they look, or where they're born here. The equivalent would be, for example, if I'm angry at China for the way that they've handled COVID, I can't turn around to a Chinese Canadian student and bully him or her. That would be bigotry. And yet it's perfectly okay to come to someone like Jonathan Carton, our client who was formerly at Columbia University, and spit on him and call him a dirty Zionist baby killer because he's Jewish and you hate Israel. And that's tolerated. That's considered political speech by the administrators. And the wrong way to respond to that is with pro-Israel advocacy. Because again, you're feeding into that affirmative defense, that excuse that it's okay to target a Jew because you hate Israel. The second thing we learned is that they speak the language of civil rights. They talk about oppression, systemic bigotry. They talk about racism, even the words like apartheid and genocide and occupation. They've manipulated human rights terminology for their cause. And as I said earlier, we're teaching our kids how to make legal arguments. The third and the fourth thing we learn is that the way that successful civil rights movements are organized, and this is key, especially for a conference like this, is they are organized from a grassroots, bottom up, with also top down coordination. Our community is very heavily topped down. We have major organizations with CEOs with big budgets who are answerable to their donors. And I want to be very clear, I am not criticizing these organizations. They serve a very important role in our community. What I'm saying is that we need to adopt the strategies that work. The organizations must adopt the strategies that work from a top-down level, and we as a community must engage in grassroots mobilization. What does that mean? It means you don't have to be on the Women's Giving Circle of APAC. You don't have to be a donor to FIDF to make a difference and demand change and demand and receive community resources and support to do so. So what we do as a movement is we empower members of the community, like every single person in this room, to form a chapter. And once you form a chapter, you meet regularly. When you meet regularly, you pick one or two issues that are of importance to you. Now, I recognize we live in a target-rich environment, and it seems sometimes completely overwhelming. Every day, we're getting another email about incidences of anti-Semitism. But I cannot stress this enough. What we've seen in the studies that is successful is when communities focus on what is locally important to them, what is important to them on a local level, and they mobilize in a grassroots fashion as a community. They pick an issue and they mobilize themselves. They don't rely on anyone else, but you mobilize yourselves to do something about that issue, and you don't stop with that issue until you have achieved the success that you desire. And if you mobilize this way and you form a chapter, the End Jew Hatred movement will provide you with free legal support. We will provide you with strategic support, and we will provide you with financial support to engage in direct actions. And this is the fourth point of the study, to ensure consequences for Jew hatred. Now, what successful civil rights movements do is they ensure consequences for the behavior that they don't want to see. You can take, for example, the Me Too movement, right? Harvey Weinstein is by no means the only male misogynist in the world. And the Me Too movement did not get rid of male misogyny, and Black Lives Matter did not get rid of, anti-Black racism. But what they did is they ensured there would be a heavy price to pay if you engage in the behavior that they were targeting. And by doing so, and by sticking on a target and not stopping until they took Harvey Weinstein down, they created a precedent and then a deterrent effect. And when I read this part of the study, it actually resonated with me, because as a civil rights attorney, this is what we do in courts of law. We attack one instance of anti-Semitism, even though there's, campus anti-Semitism, we focus on one campus. We focus on one or two or three plaintiffs that are our clients. We have a particular fact pattern, and we ensure through the legal system that there are consequences to that behavior. And once you set a precedent in a court of law, there then is a deterrent effect, a ripple effect, that people are on notice that if they behave in a similar way, they too can be held liable for that type of behavior. But unfortunately, because we live in this target-rich environment, every day it's a new anti-Semite of the week. Last week it's Roger Waters. Next week it's some BDS vote on campus, or it's Israeli apartheid week. We're losing focus. We're sending letters, we're posting, and then we're immediately moving on to the next egregious thing without ensuring consequences for bad behavior. And we must demand our organizations, with their big budgets and all their weights and all their connections, focus and ensure consequences, because otherwise anti-Semitism will continue and it will grow. And this last thing we learned also from the study was that there's always a 1-2 punch. Just like Palestine Legal, for example, works with SJP, or Black Lives Matter works with the NAACP, so too must a Jewish civil rights movement, obviously with allyship in other communities, but work in partnership with legal groups such as the Lawfare Project, such as all the other different legal groups that exist, so that the community is knowledgeable when their civil rights are violated and empowered to retain lawyers to advocate for their rights in courts of law. This is called impact litigation. And if you think about it, most of the rights, at least in America, are a product that we enjoy, are a product of impact litigation. They're a product of seminal civil rights cases that were brought on behalf of members of these minority communities. They went to the courts and they litigated to achieve the change that they want to see. Now, I can't tell you how many times in my career, not only are students or Jewish people or Israelis in the workforce unaware of what their basic rights are, so that they can't even identify when they've been violated. But once they've been violated, don't have the courage, but more importantly, don't have the support of their community to stand up and use the legal system in an aggressive fashion to enforce their civil rights. This is so important. So I'll conclude with these remarks. We have been able to form chapters all over the world for the movement. And I want to stress something. Everything happens slowly. We say here in Israel, I'm in Israel right now, I made Aliyah with my family. There's a phrase we say, le'at, le'at. I am so enthused and excited to see this group of people in the room, because all it takes is a handful of dedicated people with the right financial resources, with adequate legal support, and the right strategic guidance to make a real difference. I'll tell you the story of two young German Jewish advocates, both under the age of 28. They came to us about a year and a half ago because they were sick and tired of not being able to walk in a certain area of Berlin without fear of physical violent attacks. So they would take their kippas off, or they would put their Stars of David away. These two young men contacted the movement. We gave them the financial and legal and strategic support that they needed. They managed to gather over 450 people to stand in the very area where they were too afraid to walk, holding signs that said, "End Jew hatred in Germany." Their 450-person protest the next day made the front page of every single major German newspaper, including Der Bild. And less than 3 weeks later, at the German parliamentary electoral debate, the candidates running for office were asked the following question, quote, "What do you intend to do to end Jew hatred if you are elected?" End quote. That is the power of two young men who put on a protest. I saw, for example, in Ottawa, an incredible activist, Lisa, gathered over 700 people, the largest ever gathering, Jewish gathering in Canada's capital. She formed a chapter in Ottawa. I think about a month and a half later, they marched over to the Ottawa School Board with their End Jew Hatred teachers on, because they picked what their target issue was. They demanded change, and they received the change that they demanded. I can go on and on about these types of stories, but being from Toronto, being born and raised in Toronto, and I think my dad is there also somewhere in the audience, it is particular importance to me that we, the Toronto Jewish community, organize ourselves. And again, by organizing, I mean, when you leave this room, make a commitment that you will all meet again within the next 30 days. Pick an issue that you feel strongly about and use every single of the collective resources that you have in this room, whether it's to do a protest, whether it's to do some type of other campaign that is designed to ensure a consequence for anti-Semitism. I promise you, and I've seen it many times, and I've studied it, and I write about many examples in my book, I promise you that if you start this way, we have a chance, we have a very good chance, if we mobilize, to change the tide of what's happening. So I hope that you feel empowered when you walk out of the room. I hope that you realize that the only people that you can rely on is yourselves. I hope that you teach your students that while pro-Israel advocacy is great, and I absolutely encourage it and I engage in it, it is not moving the needle on anti-Semitism. And in fact, Jewish students, I always say, they don't have the responsibility to stand up for Israel, but they do have the responsibility to stand up for themselves. And when members of your community, their civil rights are violated, I urge you to be in touch with the attorneys at the Lawfare Project. We now have an office in Canada. We have offices in many cities around the world, so we can provide them with the pro bono legal support they need to have their rights protected. So thank you so much for having me. I'm very accessible. Adar Rubin is also in the room, who's also representing the End Jew Hatred movement. He flew in, I believe it was from Michigan. Adar, maybe you want to stand up and identify yourself. Hey, everybody. We are here for you. Please use us. Use the resources that we are offering you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to, I don't know if you have time, but if anybody has a question, I'm happy to answer. Rabbi, it's really up to you.
So Randy's asking if you have an offices here and opportunities for people to seek legal counsel. And the question is, do you have Canadian attorneys that are connected?
Oh, absolutely, we do. I mean, we're involved right now in several cases. We're representing Shai DeLuca together with David Almala, who's an incredible attorney, in his lawsuit against food vendors. And we have right now a lawsuit where we are challenging the false and misleading made in Palestine labels that are on certain products like olive oils and za'atar. And this follows, again, their frivolous legal challenges, which we won against when they were challenging made in Israel labels. And more importantly, we have a fund. And what we do is we raise money to support the litigation costs of Jewish community members and Israeli persons and businesses who are discriminated against. And I'm so happy that you're here, because one of the things actually I forgot to mention is how important it is that we break the trend in the Jewish community of multiple organizations working in their own silos, competing for donors and pretending like this is a zero-sum game. It's not. The other side works together. They coordinate together. They don't see themselves in competition. And I am a really big fan of Stand With Us, and my family supports Stand With Us. And I'm so happy you're here. And I want the Lawfare Project and the End Jew Hatred movement to work with every single organization, because we must work together in order to succeed. We have to change the paradigm of not working together. I want to mention too, the difference between a movement and an organization. So we have a lot of charitable organizations in our community. But what we're going for here is a movement. It's an idea, okay? If you believe in ending Jew hatred, you are part of the movement. And when we all get together and work under the umbrella of a movement, and we help each other, our influence and our power is magnified. So while it took 2 young men in Berlin to do their protest, End Jew Hatred movement chapters all over the world amplified what they were doing, so that when it was reported on in the German papers, and we've seen this a lot with other chapter actions, is that when they have the support of an international movement, their missions become more amplified and more powerful, and their voices carry more weight, because it's not just a group of local people doing their thing. It's a chapter of an international movement that has financial and legal backing. And I think we've proven that over the last 2 years, how we're able to amplify the actions of different community chapters.
Brooke, we have one more question. I think that's all we have time for, but.
Okay.
So this is Rahil Raza. She is a founder of Council of Muslims Against Anti-Semitism, and incidentally is also one of our presenters here today. And she is asking if there's value in non-Jewish allies being part of a movement against anti-Semitism.
So I can't see you on camera, but I'm a really big fan of yours, and I've seen a lot of your videos online, and what an honor it is for you to come and attend, really. And to answer your question, it's not just that there's value in it, it's absolutely necessary. When I was interviewing Natan Sharansky for my book, he stressed, 2 of the most important things for there to be a successful movement. The first was you have to believe in the cause more than you like your job. That's what he said. You have to go, leave your office, get out on the street and physically protest for something and show that there's actual grassroots support for what you're standing for. And the second was that you need allyship. Allyship is absolutely necessary. And the Jewish community, as I said before, has stood for almost every single minority rights cause. We were front and center marching for Black civil rights in the 50s and 60s. We founded, the new women's movement before it got taken over by Linda Sarsour and Tamika Mallory and all that politicized anti-Semitic stuff. We are there for every minority group, and yet why aren't we demanding the same for us? We have to really work on allyship, because the truth is we also don't have the numbers that we need. So thank you for raising that. I appreciate it. It's really lovely to see you.
Okay, we're going to allow one more quick question. This is Sue Ann Levy, who is also a speaker of ours today. And she actually broke the story on food vendors here in Toronto. And she's asking if you have any suggestions on how to motivate the people here in Toronto to get involved. Obviously, other than the people who are in this room, it's very difficult and very challenging to get people motivated. So do you have any advice on that?
Yes, no, and we know this. I mean, it's no secret. It's hard to get Jews out on the street. I'll say a couple things. First of all, we have to be creative. Okay, so if you look at PETA, all it took were 2 people in a can of red paint throwing it on Kim Cattrall's white fur coat to make, front page news all over the world. So that's why we have a strategy team. And the first thing you need to do is, when you organize yourself and you form a chapter, is you have to pick an issue, you have to pick a target. And then the creative part comes. You have to figure out how to achieve your goal with the resources that you have. We are in year 2 of this movement. Black Lives Matter is over 15 years old. We are in year 2. We face huge hurdles, the lack of will to mobilize, the fact that Jews don't like aggressively standing up for themselves, the fact that we have so much intergenerational trauma that we've actually adopted the language of our enemy. I mean, even using the term anti-Semitism, how many people know who invented the term anti-Semitism, where it came from? Adar, I know you know. Anti-Semitism is a term that was invented by German eugenicists as a pseudo-intellectual way of justifying their study of why the Semites are inferior. And it does not just apply to Jews. It applies to all of the Semitic races. Jew hatred is more visceral. Jew hatred is about meaning what you say. And when you sit down, you'll see when we have our next meeting, when we have our next chapter meeting, and you pick your issue, the key is how to creatively come up with solutions. We had some chapter members in California that were really sick and tired of Jack Dorsey at the time, who was the CEO of Twitter. And they couldn't mobilize 300 people. So 2 of them went to Jack Dorsey's home, took Holocaust tweets that they recorded and broadcasted into his home for several hours, the recordings of Holocaust messages that he allowed on his platform at the time. And the whole messaging there was, you're canceling COVID denial, but you're allowing Holocaust denial. They made Fox News. And Fox News, which is the #1 most watched media network in all of America, did a 7.5-minute segment about 2 activists who confronted Jack Dorsey. And several weeks later, Jack Dorsey, not because of us, but, then resigned his position. We have to be creative. I speak about in my book about all of the creative things that the Soviet Jewry movement did. A lot of it is theatrics. You'll see, Black Lives Matter, they have a lot of numbers, but they also engage in a lot of theatrics. One of the things that the Soviet Jewry movement did, for example, is they ended up taking the number of the then ambassador and posting it on a sex workers ad page. And for 3 or 4 days, until they ended up shutting down the number, they kept getting call after call after call, and it was a prank. And they kept doing these pranks because that's what they were capable of doing until ultimately it brought them to the table and they said, stop harassing us. And they started to negotiate with Natan Sharansky's colleagues because they kept insisting and they kept on the target and they kept, ensuring that there will be consequences felt, whether it was throwing rats on the stage when the ballet came to town, when the Russian ballet came to town, whether it was renaming the streets outside of the consulate to the names of Russian dissidents. They were so creative in what they did. And ultimately, after 2-3 years, they got thousands of people on the street and they were able to make a difference. And that's what we're trying to do now. And I think we even have a better chance of doing it because our activists, the young people, already know the language. They already know what to do. They're already skilled in the types of actions and protests they do for other communities. All we're asking them is to use the same tactics for ourselves. That's what we're asking. And we're here to help you. I'm here to help you. My team is here to help you. And Jew Hatred Canada is here to help you. We have to empower ourselves. Something can always be done. Well, thank you for having me. Have a wonderful conference again. I wish I could be there in person, and I look forward to being in touch.
Thank you so much, Brooke. We definitely appreciate your being here and your words of wisdom, especially considering you weren't feeling so well. So we wish you a refuah shlema, and we are very appreciative. Thank you so
I
much.
appreciate that. And if I just may, if you would all consider going on Amazon and pre-ordering a copy of End Jew Hatred, a Manual for Mobilization, because I go into detail about the strategies and case examples that we have to adopt and that we have to make work for our community. So thank you so much.